from access and awareness to trust, and the facilitators that empower patients to say yes to research, inclusion, education, empathy, and advocacy. So we're so fortunate to have today with us 4 amazing advocates. I have to tell you, they really are our Class A advocates that we have in our country. And together they'll help us understand what drives hope through access to innovation and why research as care must include every patient. So to save a little bit of time, I'm going to introduce him myself. Michel Audoin is a chair of the Patient Representative Committee at the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, CCTG, and a long-standing patient advocate. And through her work, she ensures that patient perspectives shape research, priorities, design, making trials more responsive and inclusive and more human. And to her left is Jason Abramovitch. And Jason is an early onset cancer survivor and advocate, giving voice to younger patients with his lived experience as a cancer patient. He's passionate advocate whose personal journey embodies both courage and action. And to his left, we have Martine Elias. And Martine is the Chief Executive Officer of Myeloma Canada and a leader in uniting patient organizations, researchers, and industry to drive innovation and access to trials. She brings a system-level view of how partnerships can turn patient engagement into meaningful outcomes. And last but not least is Alan Chankowsky, also a Montrealer, I should let you know. So actually, we could say that about almost three of us here. Yeah. Sherbrooke, okay. Jason, a former Montrealer as well. Alan is an author, international speaker, and cancer survivor whose inspiring story of perseverance and advocacy illustrates the power of hope and purpose. And to Alan, clinical research is not abstract, it's deeply personal and rooted in lived experience. So I look forward to hearing from all of you and hearing about your personal experiences. Well, I'm going to sit down and be part of the panel. We have a mic here, but you can hold your mic because my first question is for you, Michel. So I guess I'll do this here, since there seems to be. Oh, okay, good. Thanks. What's this? Okay, so Michel, I didn't realize this was so high. I was going to be right above you all. Okay. Why is it vital to include patient voices throughout the clinical trial process, and how do you think it makes a difference? And I really want to, I know your personal story, so please share a little bit about your personal story. This isn't an abstract question. I really want to know, and I think our audience really wants to know about what you were faced with in your own healthcare and what drove you to be an advocate as well for clinical trials.
Right, thank you so much. So first, to begin that, cancer research is not done to patients. It's done with and for the benefit of patients. So we need to keep that in mind. And so there's a lot of mistrust and misunderstandings about that. And in terms of my personal experience, it was that, I had an advanced cancer diagnosis very early on. And because I was actually diagnosed with 2 primary cancers, I was excluded from clinical trials. And so all I was told was the only hope I had was the standard of care. And as a mom with 2 kids at home, I wanted to know that there was something better for me. And, dealing with the side effects, also realizing that, racialized people, Black people, were not included in clinical trials. And so some of the side effects of treatment were affecting my quality of life. And so it was really important for me to raise the alarm bells, to speak out and say, this is really important. My needs as a person, as a mother, as a Black woman are not being addressed in clinical trials, and to make sure that, I can partner with organizations to help develop clinical trials to make sure that they're more reflective of the general population.
And how old were you when you were diagnosed?
I was just entering my 40s. And I was nursing my 2nd child.
Right, so you had a young family at home and a lot of hope, a lot of opportunities ahead of you, that's for sure. And so when you expressed yourself about those problems, were you able to make a difference? Were you able to change the way things were done?
So systemic change is really slow. So originally, I was dismissed at the very beginning, which was very disheartening. But what I kept in mind was my family and the community. So recognizing that, other Black women were speaking to me and sharing their stories, and there was similarities about being dismissed and unseen and unheard. And so that's what led me to continue to drive that hope and that systemic change.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure there's a lot of progress that we have to still make, and we'll come back to that. But let's just move on to Jason. You were an early onset patient with colon cancer, as it happens. So I know what that's like to be young and have a diagnosis like that. What was your experience, as an early onset patient, even prior to being diagnosed? What was your experience, and also did you think about clinical trials at that time?
Well, yeah, so I was diagnosed with colon cancer at 36, so definitely early onset. Very few symptoms. Life was literally completely normal. The diagnosis came out of absolute nowhere, no family history, no anything, and of course that's what we're starting to see on the rise, right? My situation is not unique anymore, unfortunately. But in regards to clinical trials, I was very fortunate that my oncologist is a research guy. He's a rock star at our hospital. And I was provided options right away in regards to research studies and clinical trials from day one. So basically, after my first meeting with my oncologist, I actually got to sit with the trial coordinators and the navigators and learn all about the trials I qualified for, decided if they were best for me or if not. It ended up being a very positive thing for me that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. However, one of the things I always point out with my particular experience is, as I've been in this space for about 5 years now, is my experience with clinical trials and the early introduction to them is actually very unique. Right, a lot of folks that I talk to and have met don't have that option and are not presented with that early on, and I'm not sure why, right? Because it's very common that you hear, even within the same hospital at times, one doctor will provide you with options, and then somebody could be sitting in the very next room with a very similar circumstance, and they're not provided that information, right? Simply because it's a different practitioner, which that's obviously a huge barrier, which I know we're going to talk about shortly.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is something that, especially if the trial isn't done at the institution where you're at, the first introduction would be the standard of care rather than the clinical trial, right? And I think that's changing now, especially because we do have, obviously, those patients who are microsatellite high, instability high, can qualify for the immunotherapy. So it's coming a little bit to the forefront, but still not, I think, the practice. And usually, standard of care is what's being offered first. But I think that's a very important change when we talk about, advancing clinical trials in Canada, where we have such a low participation rate in cancer clinical trials throughout the country, that if patients were offered that opportunity, and I love the idea of it being a right, so it's an obligation for oncologists to tell their patients about the clinical trials up front, even if they don't have it at their center immediately, that is an opportunity. The danger, of course, is to providing, information about something that they can't actually provide at their institution. But I think that is, we used to hear about that years ago. Why tell the patient about a drug if we don't have it at our hospital? So I think it's a way of changing the thinking. And Martine, you've worked in industry, you've worked in patient organizations, and you've certainly headed up clinical trials and started them in Canada. From your perspective, how can we increase the access to clinical trials in Canada, and how could patients play a role in that?
Yes, you're right. I started my career in the pharmaceutical industry in clinical research, and in those days, we used to put a hat, and you'd had active and placebo written on little pieces of paper, and you'd put that in the hat, and you mix it up, and that's how you would pick out the randomization sort of scheme for that particular trial. Now things are a little bit more, thankfully we've evolved there, so like a lot of it is electronic, but there's other areas where we have not evolved at all. I think there's three fundamental problems to clinical trial. First is patient education, knowing about trials, and I'll go a little bit more in detail into that. And the second is, having a clinical trial accessible to them, like in, sort of available. And the third is the inclusion, being able to be recruited for a clinical trial. So I'll focus on the first one, which is patient education. And I'll tell you a bit of a story. I live in Bromo, not in Sherbrooke, a small little town, and it's very busy on weekends. So I tend to go do my shopping during the week because, it's more of the locals. And there's a really nice little store that I like, and the lady's really nice. And I hadn't been there, all summer. So I walked in and started chatting with her and said, "How was your summer?" She said, "Well, not so good. I was diagnosed with colorectal cancer. And in the beginning of the summer, and I've had surgery." And I said, "Well, how are you feeling?" She said, "Well, there's ups and downs." And I said, "Well, who's your oncologist? Where are you being treated?" Like the typical question, just to make sure she was, I know so much about it, and I know what questions to ask, but I'm not, we don't realize that, not everybody is like this. We don't have that information and the know-how, to ask for it. So to make a long story short, she's, having some difficulties dealing with and her treatment. I said, "Well, have you asked about clinical trials?" And she looked at me and she said, "Well, isn't that like, I don't want to get placebo." And, I kind of, that's the level of knowledge that people have about clinical trials. They fear that, if they have cancer, that they're going to get a placebo. So I explained to her that in cancer, you don't do placebo-controlled trials. It would be unethical that, you compare the new therapy with the best standard of care. So, the worst of the worst could be that you get the same treatment, but you would get everything else in terms of care, and you could get potentially access to the trial medication if you're relapsing or if the drug doesn't work for you. And she was like very attentive and very like, "Oh my God, I didn't know any of this." So we tend to think that patients or society knows all about clinical trials and how they're conducted, that they should be part of standard of care, and they're not educated. There's a big stigma about clinical trials, and maybe it's from when we used to do clinical trials in cancer where there was a placebo. I don't ever think that we did clinical trials with placebo. So education is really important, and educating the community, educating society that clinical trials are part of, their rights, and they're part of a standard of care, and they should be much more available. So that would be my first comment on this, and I'll expand on it, the other two later in the panel.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Not only getting the information, but getting it from a trusted source. So to your point, Jason, it's so important to get it from your oncologist or from a trusted patient group or from a trusted source in any event in order to, to rely on that as a first course of treatment.
And I did say to her to contact Barry. I said, "Here's Barry's email address. You go talk to him."
That's okay. So, I mean, in my own case, I know, I had no help. I had to figure out what was going on around the world, and ultimately had to leave the country, which wasn't actually a clinical trial where I went. It was considered the standard of care there, part of it, but in Canada it was considered would have been a clinical trial. So, that's another question, what is a clinical trial? In some cases, it would be considered so in Canada, but not in another country. Alan, you have such a unique story, and you talk about, trials that, are an N of one, and your story has really captured the interest of so many, both in Canada and abroad. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened to you?
Sure. So it's amazing what you do when you have to do it. And in my case, when I was 46, I was diagnosed with a very aggressive head and neck cancer called salivary duct carcinoma. And it has just an abysmal survival rate of about, if you're lucky, 3 to 5 years. So this is 9 years later, and that's the kind of where I am today. But to get here, I was pretty much forced into figuring out that I needed to do the research, and figure out what was possible on an international basis, what can extend my life. And together with my girlfriend Cynthia, we figured out that a prostate cancer treatment was going to be the solution, at least for the first few years. And that's in fact what happened. As a head and neck cancer, I was transferred to the prostate cancer clinic, and I've been treated there ever since, continue with treatment, along with some other treatments. But along the way, it became very clear that in order to figure out my path forward, there would need to be some molecular assessment of what was driving this cancer. And when we figured it out and brought the data into the clinic to my head and neck oncologist, she was very thoughtful in the way that she approached the ask of me, which was to get onto a prostate cancer drug. So that was a very big step forward in my survival to date. But the other big thing was realizing that I was my own trial. I became really the one and only person that was being studied for my specific disease that was happening within my body. Very unlike other salivary duct carcinoma patients, I was my own trial, and that has been my stance forward to bring to other patients and to other patient communities.
So that really does reflect on our theme today, that research is care, is part of care. You know, as you went through that, you didn't mention, you made it sound very simple, you were just able to get molecular profiling, you know, right, sent to the center and so forth. But we all have encountered huge barriers in terms of our access or getting people into specific trials. Michelle, you talked a little bit about, you know, some of the systemic, you know, barriers that were, you know, enabling you to get treatment. You know, but you were at a major cancer center on top of it all. So in your role as a patient representative at CCTG, how would you see, you know, knocking down some of those barriers in the clinical trials? And you know, if you've done something about that, I'd love to hear about it.
So at CCTG, we do have a very involved patient rep committee and a patient engagement model. And our patient reps, when a clinical trial is being proposed or brought to the group, patient reps review those trials. And we ask them to walk through that trial proposal as if they themselves or their loved one was going to be enrolled in that trial, and to be able to identify the priorities, the research question, and any challenges that might come up. And then throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial, patient reps are giving feedback on the consent, the protocols, and the patient-facing materials. So that helps break down some of those barriers. That being said, we still know that there are underrepresented communities that aren't seeing themselves reflected. So it's really, really important that we acknowledge that this should be a priority, because we want these trial results to be representative of our Canadian population, and quite frankly, it's not at this point in time. And there's barriers like mistrust, misinformation, and misunderstanding, and we have to actively work at breaking down those barriers. So
that's very true, and it, as you know, as everybody knows, that in the United States, in their clinical trials, DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, is something that they are trying to eliminate, as it were. But it is extremely important to have a diverse representation in the clinical trials so that we know that the drug will work for everybody. So at the same time, that actually does present an opportunity for Canada in clinical trials, and a reason why maybe there should be further investment in clinical trials in Canada. So, Jason, when you were approached by your oncologist about the clinical trial, what in fact made you think about it more? What facilitated, that opportunity for you? I know that you said that other patients weren't as lucky because they didn't get that information up front, so we see that as a barrier. But what was the what facilitated your thinking on it?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think I will touch kind of on it from two sides as well, because there's a lot. I think the focus of this is how do we make clinical trials accessible, right? But I also had a very positive experience with clinical trials that greatly benefited my experience. So I think that's important to talk about as well. However, firstly, to answer your question, is that it started right with the oncology nurse, right from the oncology nurse, like from the very first person I talked to. She had let me know that, my oncologist would likely be talking to me about some clinical trial information. And if we decided to proceed with that, I'd get to meet the trial coordinator, who would provide me all the details and answer any questions I had. And when we actually sat down and spoke after that appointment, I quickly learned that being part of a trial or a research study or what have you, because I'm actually part of 3. So I was in 1 efficacy trial and 2 research studies. And I quickly learned that you kind of gain all these people on your team, right? You get like a trial coordinator, you get extra appointments, you're watched kind of under a microscope. And I know going home and talking about that with my wife later on to try to decide if I wanted to participate or not, for me, it almost gave me a sense of control back of the situation. And that in itself provided hope to me, because it made me feel like part of my team, right? Like I was actually be able to be part of a decision. Do I want to do this? Do I not? It wasn't kind of just, oh, here's a standard of care, you're doing it, right? I know as a young adult especially, it's very common that young adults want to be active participants in their team, not just a patient. So I think that gave me a lot of power, it really empowered me. And I know for my wife and I, it gave us a lot of hope as well, which is a theme today. So I definitely wanted to mention that as well.
You reminded me of something. You said you were approached by the nurse or your oncologist nurse. But one of the problems in hospital, and I know you were at Ottawa Hospital, so it's a little bit different there, is who can approach a patient for about a research or a clinical trial, if they're outside what is referred to as a circle of care. So I know at the Accelerated Clinical Trials Group, they talk a lot about that. How do we open up so that you don't have to opt into a trial or to receiving information about a trial. You have to opt out, about doing that. So this is another big opportunity, I think, in Canada, the question of opting in to receiving information about cancer clinical trials right from the get-go. And I think that might, I think that's exactly what happened to you, actually, without you maybe even knowing it.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I think, to even expand on that, I know to kind of throw in a little bit of a barrier, that was something that I experienced when deciding whether to accept going on to one of the trials or not, was that education piece. Like I know you had spoken about that earlier, and being 36, one day being diagnosed, a week later being sitting in an oncologist's office having to decide about surgeries, treatments, what's going to happen work-wise, financially, relationship with my family. There's so many decisions to make. The last thing that I wanted to do at that time was have to go research something else, right, and learn about something completely new. So, they were able to explain to me what a trial was. No, it's not the end of the line, right, which I thought that's what a clinical trial was at that time. And the fact that it was actually going to be helping patients coming after me, which I really never took into account. So I think that education piece right from the beginning, whether you do it or not, I think as a patient, we all have the right to know that information. And it's super critical.
Right, and coming back to that right to participate in clinical trials, which is something that I don't know how we would get that done as a sort of a patient's bill of right, to include that. And you didn't mention to the audience, but Jason was a fireman at the time, so he was putting out his own 911 at the time. So, Martine, you've seen a lot in terms of systemic barriers to participating in clinical trials. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen, both from an industry perspective and a patient patient group perspective?
Of course. there's a lot of system barriers, and I think one of the most important one that has probably the greatest impact is ethics approval and length of time that you can start a clinical trial because of these bureaucratic procedures that the trial needs to go through. I'm going to tell you another story. This is when I was working with industry, and I was doing patient relationship with patient organization. I was working with Audoin, who used to be the co-founder of Myeloma Canada, and he was very much interested and pushing and very aggressive about bringing more clinical trials to Canada, having a patient voice at the table, including patients in how you design clinical trials. So I thought, well, it'd be great to invite him to go and speak to a forum of presidents of the company, international forum of the presidents of the companies that I was working with at the time, and because he could tell them how it's done and why patient voice was really important. And at the same time, there was a clinical trial that was starting in Canada for a drug in multiple myeloma that had a lot of promise. And there was about 4 centers that were identified to participate in the clinical trial. Physicians and clinicians in the trial had already identified patients to go in the trial. And this was a competitive recruitment process. And, the global organization had reached its target for a number of patients, and they said, we're closing down the trial, we're not recruiting trials in Canada because your ethics system was way too long and we couldn't get ready in time. And all these patients who had been identified were now left without access to a clinical trial. So Aldo, and was ballistic. People who knew him at the time, he was, very vocal. And I'm thinking, oh my God, he's going to talk to, presidents of the company that I'm working with. I need to fix this problem. And so we, worked together, got on the phone, talked to the right people at the company, and, had them agree and open up clinical trial slots for patients who had been identified to participate in the clinical trial. But it took, almost a catastrophe so that we could make this happen. This should not be the norm. I mean, to make Canada competitive for clinical trial, we have to fix the system because without a proper, healthcare system to open up clinical trial, companies are not going to come to Canada. So we have to make it, sort of very much attractive. And we are a small country, and we need clinical trials because of our healthcare system, because of our reimbursement process, because of, how things are done here. They become a lifeline for cancer patients. So we have to make it a lot more conducive to bring clinical trial and, things in the health system. I know there's, these are not intentional. People are not doing this on purpose to not, be ready for clinical trials. But I think we all have to find ways to change that for the sake of patients.
You remind me, the head of the Lady Davis Research Institute came into my office a few months ago, and he said that one of the problems in Canada was the time to get a trial started. So exactly what you were saying, not just the consenting, but to get the whole trial started. And he said he went to Australia and he got it done right away. So we're going to hear from Kurt tomorrow on who's the CEO of Clinical Trials Australia, on how that works and how we can learn from getting trials started faster here in Canada. But that certainly is a barrier to investment in this country. And I reflected before, during the question period, I said, we had the people from Denmark, who presented and talked about public-private partnerships. This is another very important opportunity for Canada, at this time, in order to make those investments when we're looking for a way to do things a little bit more different to make clinical trials more accessible. And like I said, Alan, you made it sound so simple. So we know that we have unequal access to molecular profiling in the country from our own surveys, even sometimes within the same center, or certainly within the province, let alone across the country. Yet you were able to access it. So what helped to facilitate your access, first of all, to the molecular profiling, and then to the treatments? How did that work?
Well, there were a couple of key things that contributed to my accessing molecular assessment. The first of which was my knowledge. It happened to be a family member, one of my favorite cousins, if not my favorite cousin, who told me about molecular profiling. I looked into it and realized quite quickly that, yeah, this is for me. Back in 2016, when I was diagnosed, it did require me to do a lot of legwork, a lot of admin stuff, a lot of working with the pathology lab who had my tissue, sending it out to the testing facility out in Boston. But it began with knowledge. It began with me understanding that this was going to be an important, if not a critical step to my survival.
Right. So you had to go to the U.S. for your molecular profiling, and
Yeah.
we do know that one of the major private, or several of the major private companies that do the profiling are out of country. You have one in Canada. But essentially what we're looking for is at each cancer center that we have that opportunity. And while in some centers it's a standard of care, depending on who you are and what disease site you have, whether it's in Quebec or in Ontario or elsewhere across the country, it's certainly not uniform. Even in Quebec, it's not uniform. And a big problem that I have with it is the return of results. So even when you can access it, sometimes they don't come back so quickly. That's number one. And secondly, in some provinces, like in Quebec, they don't like to return the results on mutations where they don't have a drug to address that mutation. And I think that that's really a bad situation for patients. I remember going back to the early days when cetuximab was one of the first that required KRAS testing, and a young lady in Ontario approached us, and of course she knew that she could access a drug outside the country, but couldn't get access to the testing, and actually had to leave the country for the testing in order to get it done. So this has to be integrated as a sine qua non for any treatment of cancer patients. I think that if we're talking about increasing access to clinical trials, we have to make sure, and this is a jump maybe, but that every cancer patient is profiled up front when they're diagnosed. And that, is a bit of jump because people will say, well, I'm wasting all these resources on people that don't need it, but they may not need it now, but we want to keep that door open for that knowledge for clinical trials ahead should their cancer advance. So I suspect, I don't have the evidence yet, but that if we did that testing up front for everybody, that it would bring the cost down and it would make the system much more networked and much more user-friendly for clinical trials, for sure. So have you done any thinking about that, about access to molecular profiling, Michelle, at CCTG or otherwise? And because you're not going to get into, although those are academic trials, you're not going to get into a trial, for a specific mutation on a precision medicine unless we know your profile. So if we can't identify the patient, how do we get them into the trial?
It's a really good question. For me specifically, it's what I can do on my end to access, information about my cancer type. And so, maybe I wasn't enrolled in a trial early on like I wanted to, but my tissue sample and my blood samples have been in studies. And so that information gets fed back to me. And I know more about my cancer. My oncologist knows about my cancer. And then knowing that down the road that there's better access to treatments when the disease progresses, that I can have those. And so I think that's really important to say that, clinical trials aren't necessarily, those treatments, but it's also, the research, the blood, the liquid biopsies, the ctDNA, all of that is also care.
Right, and that's another new thing. We're starting to see greater access to some liquid biopsies. We're certainly not home yet, certainly not on the reimbursement side. So that, again, that's something that, for us as patients that we have to work on. So if you were to do something, I know, Jason, you've been very active both in Canada and outside of Canada in increasing knowledge among other patients and so forth. What do you see as the greatest challenge in informing patients to take that next step, to learn about their disease, to learn about clinical trials, and to learn about profiling?
Yeah, that's the golden ticket question, I guess. But no, I guess firstly, I think I truly believe, like when I entered my cancer diagnosis, I learned very quickly that as a patient, I had a responsibility as well, right? Like it's kind of a two-way street where not only did I trust my team to provide me the best care and information that I needed to make educated decisions, but I also had to become an educated patient, right? So I think that is very important. I do think that there should be more information provided to patients. Like I've done a lot of work, spent a lot of time getting myself to the point where I'm at, like to the point where I'm at now. And I think I was only able to do that because I went through chemotherapy, I'd say relatively easy, if you want to say that. I recovered from surgery really well. Everything's kind of gone very textbook. So I was in a position, like physically, health-wise, that I was able to put time in to learning and educating myself, where a lot of people are not, right? So I think the first question is, where are those people? You know, when they're really in the thick of things, and the last thing they want to do is read an article on a computer, take a course, educate. Like, how are we going to get them that information?
Right, so we really have to think about how we're educating patients, because we want it to be meaningful for them and to have the right information at the right time. That's where I think patient organizations play a role, but also within each of the institutions, I think there's an obligation on the oncologists to actually, with their team, to help to facilitate that type of information. So I'm going to start to move on to waving a magic wand, Martine. You know, from a system point of view, you know, and given the patient perspective, what should we do to change, do you think, and increase access to clinical trials in Canada?
I'm going to use Jason as his own example, where you mentioned that you were diagnosed with, colorectal cancer. You were offered a clinical trial. Obviously, they were looking at you from, he would be a good candidate because, your cancer and your chemistry responded to the inclusion-exclusion criteria for the trial. But then you mentioned that, what was going to be the impact on your family, on your relationship, on your job. So those are things that clinical trials don't look at in terms of, can this person participate? But are there other barriers that are not necessarily, related to the cancer or to the biochemistry of the person that are not included in making decisions about clinical trials? And so one of the things that we started to do at Myeloma Canada, it's a project called Phase Zero, where we're looking at, could we identify those barriers before the person becomes eligible for a clinical trial or could enter a clinical trial, so we can take care of those issues beforehand and have solutions to address. Well, in your case, you were a firefighter. Firefighters, as far as I know, don't work Monday to Friday. They work 24/7, 7 days a week. So is there a clinical trial where you could attend if you're still continuing to work on a Saturday or on the Wednesday when it's your day off? Could they accommodate that in terms of, your availability to go to the clinic for the clinical trial? The designs of clinical trials today are changing, but they're not quite there to accommodate for more people to be included in clinical trials that live differently and work or have families and have, sort of social, cultural issues or, financial barriers. Could you have satellites going to smaller locations in Canada as opposed to having to come to downtown Montreal or downtown Toronto? So those are things that, we could look at in the future and kind of to facilitate and to improve access to the clinical trial, but also the design of the clinical trial. And I think, Alan, you're the example of, you were your own clinical trial person because you went and did, your own research because your specific cancer and DNA was responding to a prostate cancer drug. Now, could that be done beforehand to say, hey, we do the genetic profiling of every newly diagnosed cancer? Maybe you don't have the answer today, but maybe in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, with AI, we'll be able to say, oh, your cancer started here, evolved over here, and became this. Therefore, this, drug or treatment would be you would be responding to that, but you won't get there if you don't start doing it right from the get-go. You may not have the answer today, but science is evolving so fast that by the time you do, you'll need that information and it'll be too late.
Yeah, you really raised some really interesting points. So the Government of Canada invested a huge amount of money in this accelerated clinical trials group to accelerate access to clinical trials in CanTrain, for example, in terms of training programs. But really when we talk about decentralized trials, we're thinking about how do we get a trial that may be done in a major institution in downtown whatever city, Canada, but how do we get it out to the community? As Andreas pointed out earlier today, he says that I live, north of the city. I'm not going to be able to access, a trial so easily, let alone the testing. And what we found, I know, in our work in providing grants for access to molecular profiling or increasing access to molecular profiling is that they're totally unprepared in the community to do that type of profiling. So we need to do that training more. We need to also recognize that community centers have to be funded to do clinical trials so we can train the staff and have that more decentralized type of trial and have more diversity and equity and inclusion into those trials. So, Alan, wave the magic wand. Your amazing story. How do we, facilitate other people to get the type of care that's required when needed in those urgent circumstances when it seems like there's nothing around you? How do we do that?
I think that it begins with a rejigging of how we classify cancers. I think that the traditional model of site of origin is not as relevant today as it was in years past. I think that the biology of any one specific cancer will be unique to that person. If you take 10 people with colorectal cancer, same stage, same grade, what have you, each of those biologies will be slightly different for each of those individuals, and therefore the solutions might look very different for each of those 10 people. If we start to reclassify cancers in accordance with the molecular alterations or the drivers of the cancer, that opens up a whole window of possibilities, including stratification to clinical trials on the basis of alterations rather than site of location. It also avoids the misunderstanding that in the metastatic setting, site of origin really doesn't make all that much sense if you think about it. It's already metastatic. It's in other organs of your body. So why are we still looking at site of origin as a determiner of treatment? So if I were to wave a magic wand, it would be reclassifying cancer as we know it today in accordance with molecular drivers.
I think we've begun to do that, but we definitely are not seeing that regularly. And I think that is something that we have to also speak to our people at our health technology assessment bodies, because when we see these tumor agnostic type of drugs, for example, with certain mutations, our HTA, Canada's Drug Agency, and INES here in Quebec are reluctant to approve it based on phase 2 data. And as we saw from Rebecca's presentation, many of these new precision medicines are only going to have phase 2 data because we're identifying smaller and smaller subgroups. So we have to really motivate both our regulatory and our HTA bodies and our payers, most importantly, to come along with that way of thinking. Go ahead.
Yeah, I will say that the FDA, as of this month, they have approved 10 tumor agnostic treatments for cancer. And the pace is accelerating. So we know where this is going. It's just a matter of time as to, how long is this going to take until the process catches up to clinical level care.
Right. I mean, we've covered a lot of territory, and I just want to give an opportunity if anybody has a last word, and I'd like to open it up for some questions. I mean, these are people who have lived experience in terms of accessing clinical trials, both with success and sometimes with pushback. So did you have any last words, first of all?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to say is, in terms of designing clinical trials that are inclusive and diverse, we have to address the blind spots, right? And that's the data. We need the race-based data. We need to see that who is enrolling in our clinical trials and what are their needs, right? It can't just be like the Field of Dreams movie with Chankowsky. If we build it, they will come. They're not going to come because there's inclusion-exclusion criteria, and they're not at the table designing these clinical trials. So we really have to address those blind spots and make sure that we have the data to support what we're doing and make sure those communities are involved.
Very important point. Anybody else? Before?
Sure,
Jason?
yeah. I think I found the earlier presentation and panel actually really interesting as a patient because obviously I'm not from the medical world. I'm a patient, right? That was my first introduction to this world. I get to come to these things and speak from my personal experience and an advocate, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know the system, I know how this world works, because I don't. But I'm always in awe of how much red tape and bureaucracy and behind the scenes stuff and how many layers of things have to happen before something gets presented to a patient. But what I wanted to close with for myself anyway is most of the events that I go to and speak at, and it kind of happened again this morning, is they very rarely hear anybody actually say, like, has anybody asked a patient what they want? Like, what do they want from a trial? What would make it more appealing to them? Why would they say yes to a trial? Why would they say no to a trial? Because I think that's really the foundation of, yes, there's funding, there's all these different things that have to happen, but at the end of the day, if we don't know why a patient is entering a trial, obviously it's for a cure, if that's your situation, but not all the time. Like, there's so many other layers. Like, for myself, it improved my quality of life drastically, right, for a lot of different reasons. So I think it's not just that cure when we think about trials. So maybe thinking about it from that patient's perspective, or asking a patient, what do you actually want out of a trial, right? Why would you say yes? Why do you say no? And kind of like build off of there, because it's not always just that medical reason, right? It's kind of looking at the person as a whole. So that's just what I would leave it with.
Thank you. Martine?
I think another very important point in clinical trials are clinical trial endpoints, and those have been moving quite significantly, especially in myeloma and some of the blood cancers, looking at MRD, or minimal residual disease. So it's a way to measure, what's left or not left of your cancer in your body, in your bone marrow. And the FDA and EMEA has approved MRD as a relevant endpoint. So now what? What do you do with that? Because it's being measured in clinical trial, but they're still holding their hats on overall survival and progression-free survival, which are valid endpoint. But the good thing is that drugs now are keeping patients alive much longer, so your overall survival in some trials could be 18, 20 years. So that's fantastic, but you don't get that final endpoint to conclude your clinical trial until that is done. So, it's kind of holding on to what's old and looking at what's new, but not sure how you're going to include it into your decision-making process. How is MRD going to become like the primary endpoint of a clinical trial? Because if you could get to that, you get to it very quickly. So you could, have your results in a trial within a year or two, and then boom, you're done, and you put it to the health authorities, they review it, and it's approved. So drugs can be approved much sooner and much quicker. So those are things we need to incorporate more, and I know Canada is thinking about this, but they're kind of slow in adopting some of those, newer types of surrogate endpoints. And I was at a Health Canada conference back in March, and there was a lot of questions about how to incorporate this, and is it the good thing? But from a patient perspective, yeah, like do it now, because we need these drugs. The innovation is so kind of amazing and mind-boggling that you cannot afford to wait until you get the complete answers. So have a little bit of faith, and take a bit of risk, and what's important for the patient may not always be what's important, what health authorities are thinking in terms of what the proper endpoint should be. And I think there's got to be more conversation about that.
Yeah, I was speaking of which, and Louise and others, you may be filing input on the HEMA report or draft report. What's important to patients. It seems that they're deprioritizing patient preferences, or they would like to. It's a draft report. What are the endpoints of a trial that are important to patients? May not be what they are looking at in terms of their health technology assessment at all. And I think that this is if you haven't provided input or you're thinking, I think we have until the 30th. Till the 30th to provide input to that report. Very, very important if we are going to include patient preferences.
I think that's, a little bit unrealistic to provide a report of this nature and give patient organization, only a week or so. So I encourage people to provide their input. Forget the deadline. I mean, this is so important that we've got to have our voices heard. So we'll make our own deadline. It's not them who's going to tell us that that's their deadline. We're going to tell them this is our deadline because we need to provide input. Right, Louise?
Alan, did you have a last word that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I want to just, in the age of AI, I think that the communication between the patient and their physician needs to be kind of reassessed, re-understood, reimagined to reflect the realities of what patients are doing today. Everyone has, or most people have a phone or access to the internet, and I think that it is unrealistic at this point to assume that a patient is not going to come into the clinic with even a scant amount of research. Some level of research will be brought into the clinic. And I think that depending on who your clinician is, will determine how the course of treatment is going to unfold for that particular patient. I think that the patient-physician dynamic with respect to how genomically intelligent the patient is, for example, someone like me coming into a clinician's office who perhaps is a traditional oncologist, who may not have the awareness that I have, because I've drilled down hard on my disease in terms of the research I've done, that can create some conflict. But if you take someone like me walking into a clinician's office who is very well aware, very well equipped to handle these types of conversations, I think it makes for a much more smooth patient experience. So I think the communication, the overall communication in today's age needs to be re-examined.
Yeah, and I think artificial intelligence will play a big role. It already is. I know from our European meetings recently that many of the patient groups are, and have already, as Martine knows, included artificial intelligence as one of the tools they utilize when reviewing information for patients. So I know the scent of lunch is upon us. I do have an opportunity to provide you with to ask a couple of questions if you'd like, and don't be shy. Remember this, we're all friends here. Go ahead, Louise.
Is it working? It's hard to know actually where to start responding and asking questions. Alan, just briefly to your point, we need a revolution in the way we review and approve drugs in this country, and I don't think there's any question about that. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Social determinants of health is, as all of you who know me in this room know, I never can let them rest without commenting about them. And underserved populations are not getting into clinical trials, they're not staying in clinical trials, and so we're not getting really good data about the impact of the trials and the drugs on these underrepresented populations. And there are a number of ways that we can improve that. I won't I won't give you a list, but please talk to me because I spend a lot of my life thinking about this and working on it. But having patients, to your very first question, I think, Barry, was, why get patients involved? Well, that's one of the reasons to get patients involved. If patients were actually principal investigators, if you had been an investigator, Michelle, developing that trial, I highly doubt that the exclusion criteria would have looked the way they look. And the other thing is financial toxicity. And that, a lot of what you've been able to do is because you've had the ability to do it financially. And the Canadian Cancer Society did an excellent report on financial toxicity. And we've got to build trials that build in funding so that these underrepresented populations can actually realistically be involved in the trial. And my last point would be, you've got to build relationships with trusted partners. Barry, that was your point. And that will be doctors that deal with underrepresented populations. It may be poverty groups. It may be housing groups. It's not necessarily the usual suspects. So I think there's just so much work we can do in this area, and I think it would give us such a richer experience of the Canadian mosaic.
Thanks, Louise. And just to your point about data and Michelle's point, the importance of collecting the data that's not being collected now. And Michael will talk about, Michael Dong, a little bit later about the importance of sharing the data. I mean, this is really a big thing. Dr. Auer.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I wanted to touch on something that Martine alluded to around risk, because we haven't talked a lot about risk, but I feel like the risk aversion when it comes to privacy law, when it comes to data sharing law, when it comes to regulations around consent is a huge barrier. And I think it's a barrier that's even higher for patients who maybe lack a higher level education or maybe come from a different socio-economic demographic where maybe that trust, again, isn't built. And just, a few examples, because of the new law in Ontario around biobanking, I can consent a patient to take out their rectum, anus, vagina, uterus, and give them a colostomy, and that's one page. But if I want to take a piece of that tumor and bring it to the lab, that's 10 pages that they need to read and initial multiple places. It doesn't make any sense. We have, with the cholangio Carcinoma Collaborative, we have a protocol to offer patients molecular testing through Terry Fox that would benefit them. It would give them a CAPCLI-approved report. But as a physician, I'm not allowed to ask my own patient because that might be a conflict of interest. Where's the conflict of interest? So just kind of like who in the ecosystem is best served? Is it patients and patient groups? To try and tell this story to the government regulators, provincial and federal, who are making these rules that are absolute barriers to integrating research into care. Like, who can tell this story, and why is it so hard to tell?
So a lot of those barriers, or some of those barriers, can be reduced by having the patient consent at the very beginning of their treatment, perhaps. But I don't know how to reduce the paperwork that you're referring to. That, I think, is something to be worked on. I know that we've worked on, in many cases, reducing the amount of pages and explanation for consent in general. I mean, I still think there's work to be done there. But, the idea of pre-consenting patients, to those very types of things that you're referring to, whether it be to find out about the research or to participate in research or to be asked questions such as you posed. I don't know, did any of you have any comments with respect to that?
I can't figure out why pathology labs are so protective and their hospital systems are so protective over tissue. It has been mind-boggling for me from a patient's point of view. I cannot understand the paperwork that I have to consent to as a patient to get tissue to be sent out of the hospital. It's challenging. So from a physician's perspective, I feel for you. I don't know, I'm not in your shoes, but from a patient's point of view, we have the same or similar experience.
So with that said, one more question, sorry. Cheryl.
Yeah, just quickly, two things. I was just at a European conference, and 2 of the clinical trials that were started in CML had to be canceled because the patients refused to commit to them. So patient education is quite a thing to do. I was amazed too. They just didn't want to displace themselves to the center. And I think if they were educated on what the value was going to be for all the other CML patients to come, they probably would have done it. But I think we need to start thinking about, I was just thinking about when people were talking, that we need to reframe that research is like infrastructure. And we need to, I think with what's going on south of the border and what Canada is trying to do now, I think we need to start thinking that Canada's clinical research infrastructure strengthens economic sovereignty and creates high-value jobs and accelerates innovation and exports. And I think we need to really take this message to our economic PhD PM, who will be able to understand the value that is going to come from all of this right now.
I think that's a great call to action, and something that we started off the meeting with, saying, you know, how are we going to work together to bring about change? We're going to hear some more proposals, of course, based on the Canadian Cancer Society report or draft report at this point, and we're going to get perspectives from out of country. So stay tuned, enjoy your lunch, and I look forward to this afternoon. Thanks to our panel.